I'll first start with what peace journalism is, because honestly, when I was, the more I study peace journalism, the more I've realized that not a lot of people know about peace journalism. So peace journalism was first, the idea was first coined by this Norwegian peace scholar, Juan Galtung, in the 60s and the 70s, when he looked at how a small problem in the West is projected as bigger than a bigger problem in the East or in the global South. So he then looked at, and we also are familiar with the works of Professor Lily Kuliaraki from the London School of Economics, who talks about the hierarchies of human life, whose life is more important than whose life, right? We also saw that in the coverage of the Ukraine war, of how refugees from Ukraine were treated differently, with open arms than refugees from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, and Myanmar, and so many other parts in the global South. So peace journalism was coined as an idea that has four important aspects. The first one is to put peace before conflict in your reporting. So instead of war-oriented, win-win, victory-oriented reporting, the reporter or the journalist focuses on peace, on the fact that then the conflict prevention. Then one of the other four aspects of peace journalism deals with people versus the elite. So peace journalism will focus on people, on their suffering, on their vulnerability, on bringing their voice to the foreground and pushing the voice, which is already of the elites, which is already a lot, which is very prominent and predominant in the Western media and any other part of the world in the media, to put it at the back. So give agency to the person who's the victim of either the conflict, the war, or any crisis, or even humanitarian crisis. So technically, peace journalism started as journalism that talks about peace, bringing peace after the war or conflict, but also writing about peace in a way where a conflict can be prevented before it erupts. So pre-conflict journalism and post-conflict journalism, which are two different ways of doing journalism. I also say that there is no one way of doing journalism. There's no one formula or one golden rule of how journalism is done. One of the ways people affected by war and conflict can be reported is through peace journalism. So putting the voice of the ordinary people first, fighting propaganda with truth instead of advocating or being partisan to political elite and their agenda and propaganda. You talk about the truth. So that's peace journalism, talking about peace. I also talk in the book that the absence of war does not mean that there is peace. Now, you see, let's just take the example of Afghanistan. There is no war in Afghanistan right now, but is there peace? Then I will then go to Martin Luther King's concepts of positive peace and negative peace. Negative peace is when there is no war. Yes, people are not being killed on a daily basis. But positive peace is when there is justice, when people are happy, when there's harmony, when there's education, when you're not scared that your child is going to go to sleep hungry. Now, again, peace journalism really reorientates the responsibility of a journalist. What is a journalist doing in a conflict zone? Is the journalist reporting for or on behalf of the oppressor, or the journalist working in the public interest for the public? And that is what makes peace journalism and peace journalists different from other forms of reporting from war and conflict zones. Who are you working for? Are the people and the public on your agenda, or is it the oppressor or the perpetrator of that crisis, as I call it in my book? So what peace journalism can bring in is different ways of reporting. First of all, of course, it's not very easy to do peace journalism, because when you're talking about the perpetrator and the kinds of crime and oppression that they're doing with oppressed, you are basically nudging the status quo. You're writing about propaganda. You're writing about what they're actually doing, and it does not necessarily mean that it's the government that's doing. We have a lot of other militias and other parties that they're more than one party to a conflict and more than one stakeholder to a conflict. So peace journalism will then try to help people deliberate. What is deliberation? Deliberation is to think before you make up your mind about something. Deliberation is done when a society is conscious, when it has consciousness, which is why I write in my book that peace journalism is something that attracts journalists with conscience, conscientiousness. They don't want to do the wrong thing. They don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Does not mean that they have to become politicians or they have to become advocates. They are just standing with the truth. And as we know, it is not as simple as in the global south as it can be in the global north. So then you make people think. How are you going to make people think? Are you going to make people think by just reporting, this happened in the morning, these many people were killed, this is what is going to happen, this is what the government is going to do, the relief has been sent, and that's it, end of story? Or are you going to add value for people to have the context? Why is it happening? Who is behind this? How many people are being affected? In fact, if anything, peace journalism requires journalists to go out there and do a bit of more research than just sitting on their computers and depending on press releases. So it is to evoke the people, to make them think and then do action. And how can you make so then I also talk about empathy and sympathy. So being empathetic will mean that you feel bad for the suffering of another, because as you can see towards the end of my book, I then start talking about generally about peace journalism and not specifically about Afghan refugees. I start talking about theoretical concepts of peace and deliberation and how can we start a conversation. And then there is sympathy. And sympathy will only be felt by people who have been in this situation, who knows or who know how it feels to be part of that vulnerable group that is being oppressed. And then I talk about empathy by action and empathy by voice. Not everyone can do something in action, but there's always mobilizing the public through your voice, raising your voice, thinking, as I said, deliberation. And that's why I re-theorize peace journalism as a deliberative practice, as a democratic intervention into dominant colonial ways of doing journalism, where the ordinary is not the object but the subject. They take action. They take power, and they determine what our suffering is, what are we going through, and then so the people can listen to them through their own voice. It's very interesting because this debate is happening in most of the Western media right now, in the light of coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict, or Israel's war on Gaza, to put it more accurately. I know that one of the critiques of peace journalism is that it is advocacy. It is advocating for something. To an extent, yes, because it advocates for the end of war. It advocates for the ordinary to be listened to. It advocates for listening. It advocates for ethical listening and active listening. It does not want you to watch a documentary or read a piece of news and then turn your TV off or turn your screen off and say, all right, whatever. It wants people to think. Objectivity, now it will be a bit radical and a bit controversial, but objectivity is a very relative term. Objectivity looks good as a term when a white journalist from the global north talks about it. Objectivity, the word objectivity, does not suit a journalist who comes from a media landscape where they can be shot for what they're writing, right? So what happens is that in the global south, or more specifically in a conflict zone, journalism then becomes a responsibility. It becomes a responsibility, but at the same time, it also becomes a very big threat to the journalists themselves. Peace journalism does not ask journalists to throw away objectivity and start becoming activists. No, activism is separate, journalism is separate. Peace journalism just reminds journalists to know that you have to be objective, but you should be subjective towards the truth. You cannot be objective when there is human suffering. Peace journalism is not a very ordinary type of journalism. It's not me going out, it's not me or a journalist going out and reporting on a tennis match. It is not a journalist going out and talking about a new road that is being constructed between between two parts of the city. It is about peace and war, and it's about conflict, and it's about human suffering. And if you start becoming objective in a way where you start, in peace journalism, becoming 100% objective will mean that you don't want to question the status quo. This means that you are not fulfilling the responsibility that journalism was started for. What was journalism started for? How did journalism start? Journalism started as these small journals that were very quietly undercover printed by certain groups or certain members of the community to inform the public about what are the status quo of the powerful people doing with you. Open your eyes. And then slowly, of course, it became a money minting business and a form of capitalism. And then there were more and more. These days, if you want to be a powerful person in the global south, you go and start your own media channel because that gives you absolute authority. So I do understand and I respect that a journalist should be objective in that they are not taking sides of the oppressor. Because when it comes to war and conflict, you are not only reporting how many people were killed on both sides. You are talking about people whose lives are turned upside down. Their future generations are going to live a life of a refugee. And that's why peace journalism is not for everyone. Peace journalism is not everyone's cup of tea. Peace journalism is only done by journalists who are ready to side with the truth no matter what. And it is a very dangerous form of journalism. And that's why you don't find a lot of journalists doing that. But in no way peace journalism expects journalists to become activists. Unfortunately, talking about human rights sounds like something only activists would do. But I think because of this exponential increase in the power, and with power comes corruption of these media companies, and of course becoming lobbies for certain political parties, I think a journalist needs to be very clear on which side they are standing on. Are they on the side of the public, or are they on the side of the group, or on the side that is oppressing that public and is lying to that public? But peace journalism is only and only done in the context of in the context of war and conflict. And of course, post-war, post-conflict. Peace journalism does not mean that there are two people on my neighborhood, they're fighting, and now I go and I solve their battle over who gets this piece of land in my neighborhood. That's not peace journalism. It's a counter narrative to war mongering in journalism. It's about not playing with the roles of who is the victim and who is the perpetrator. Peace journalism will make sure that these definitions are not casually thrown. You do not make the victim out of the perpetrator. You do not make a perpetrator out of the victim. So yes, it's a very thin line, but I think I personally think that some aspects of these traditional old school objectivity do not apply to new forms of journalism, specifically when it's not just the journalist in the ground. You have social media, you've got digital platforms, you've got information coming from all grounds. You have a phone, you go out, you can become a journalist. And so with these changing times, we need to also look at how some of the definitions need to be changed, or how we practice that needs to be changed in certain contexts. And again, I will end on that note, that the definitions created by the global north or by the colonial media must not be and will not be applied to journalism or how journalism should be done in the global south, because it's a very different terrain. Yeah. Very interesting question. Yes, David Leon is a very prominent critic of peace journalism. But the thing is that if we go by that definition of there's only either good journalism or bad journalism, then that means that we cannot categorize any form of journalism. We cannot say environmental journalism, because at the end of the day, every bit of journalism is journalism. In the sense, by definition, it's journalism. It's like, what are you doing? I'm having dinner. Or what are you eating for dinner? Is it chicken? Is it vegan? Is it noodles? Is it Asian food? Is it Indian food? Whatever, right? So there will always be specificities to the form of journalism and what is applicable. If I go to Afghanistan right now, for instance, or say I go to some of the Pacific Islands or some part of the world that has environmental issues, such as flooding, right? Now, if I go and report about flooding, will it be environmental journalism? Will it be peace journalism? Will it be good journalism or bad journalism? Every journalism is good or bad journalism. But then what is your purpose? You see, there is duty, which in academic terms is the deontological approach aspects, and the other one is purpose. All journalisms have a duty to inform, duty to question, duty to bring that information to the limelight or whatever. But then there's a purpose. Do you have a purpose or you don't have a purpose? This is what makes peace journalism different from other forms of journalism, or environmental journalism for that matter different from other forms of journalism, or human rights journalism, because you have a purpose as well. So that is there. And David Leon is not the only one who is a critic. He was one of the early critics in the time when Professor Jake Lynch was I think trying to bring peace journalism into public conversation, which he still is, and he's one of my mentors and one of the people, Professor Jake Lynch, that I look forward to, look up to. There is also this advocacy and activism thing that I talked about. You see, every sort of action that is trying to make a difference, a change, a social change, for social justice, or for the people who are not represented in mainstream media, it will always have some kind of critique. And I think critique makes us question what is wrong with peace journalism, why is it not effective, or and then make it better. And on coming to your second part, is journalism effective? I think peace journalism is effective, but it is a process, as Juan Galtung also puts it. Just like propaganda does not happen in one night. You cannot undo these things and the damage. So peace journalism basically is trying to undo the damage of propaganda journalism, right? And it will take time. It will take time. It will be effective in some spaces. It will not be effective in some other spaces. It will be effective where there's less control of media, where media is more, it's freer. There's a lot of research on peace journalism that is coming out from Norway and from Scandinavian countries. And you will be surprised. Like, there's no war there, but there is a flexibility to understand their different ways of doing journalism. And it has been effective in a way where people have now started to understand that not all refugees are terrorists as otherwise portrayed by the dominant media, that they are being humanized. They are humans. They have, for example, some of the examples in my book, one of them was about intermarriages between Pakistani men and Afghan women, or Afghan men and Pakistani women. And now they were being separated, and how these stories bring their voice and just depoliticizes a relationship between two people, irrespective of which country they come from. So yeah, for anything that has a purpose, it will take some time. But the only thing is that it needs to be done, and it needs to grow as well. In my recent work, I also talk about why peace journalism not as effective as it should be on paper, as effective as it looks on paper. Why? What is stopping it? And I do talk about the blind spots of peace journalism, of how people work, how people do not understand how they are being manipulated, their thought process is being manipulated. And one of the points that I was trying to make is that in other recent research that I'm doing, there's more evidence of peace journalism in the African subcontinent than in other parts, which makes me think, is it because media tends to be a bit more free, or because they're not involved in an active war that is in the interest of the superpowers of this country, of this world, right? So when these big superpowers, when their agenda starts moving, I think peace journalism will become very depoliticized. At this point, peace journalism is very political, has been politicized. One last thought on that is that it's always very difficult to convince people to talk about peace, and it's very easy to convince people to go into war. And so peace journalism also faces the same problems. I don't know if it's human nature, or is it because of how our brains are conditioned? We don't like talking about peace. And we're not very interested in talking about peace or listening to peace. We look at a few heart-wrenching stories or journalism documentaries from Gaza, or about the Rohingya in Myanmar or in Sudan, and we feel bad, and then we say we have compassion fatigue. We have shown so much empathy, we have shown so much compassion, and now we are exhausted. We don't want to. So there are different aspects, because yes, it plays on the human brain. People get traumatized. So yeah, even as a researcher, there have been times when I just cannot take it anymore, and I just need a break, because now as a human, I'm getting affected by all these stories that I'm reading, and it's not easy to be researching or to be doing journalism where you see children being killed and hundreds of them, and older people, and so it takes time. It's a process, and I'm also learning, just like everyone else is. It's learning on the go. I think the narrative still remains, but because of the politics of the region, as I said, their agenda keeps changing, keeps shifting. From what I understand, from what very little research that I've done over the last year about this, I think they're not allowing journalists. There's not a lot of access. When a lot of Afghan refugees were sent to Torkham, which is one of the checkpoints on the Duran line, there was a certain some of my colleagues, former colleagues, and my friends had told me, and some of the journalists that I had interviewed for another research, that they are not allowed to go beyond a certain line. They're not even allowed to talk to these people. So whatever images are coming out, they're coming out on social media. And so that can, of course, become a very big problem for peace journalism, the access. And so in my current research, I'm looking at how can these places be more accessible. And one of the answers is drone technology, but journalists cannot afford that that amount of to buy that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's not a lot of access. There's a lot of silence on, and a very cautious peace journalism, as I said in my book as well. They're being very careful about what to say and what not to say. The reason I said I'm on stolen land is because this is indigenous land, and the British colonial powers, when they invaded this land, they made this land their own. And now the very indigenous people here are the vulnerable people who are at the mercy of their invaders. I take this understanding back to the context of Pakistan and Afghanistan. This is more of a history, political history, and the history of the land, basically. The Afghans have been on this land for more than 5,000 years, and that is documented history. Maybe they were there even before that. And until the colonial British powers came to the Indian subcontinent, this Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the Balochistan part, and it's documented in history books, was part of the greater Afghanistan or Loy Afghanistan. And so it's only after the British decided that we need a line, which is a Duran line and which is not a border, internationally recognized border, is when a part of Afghanistan was separated and given and put into the Indian subcontinent, which was later broken into two parts to create what is now Pakistan. But this does not change the association of the people that they have with this land. And so my grandparents were a collateral of these colonial lines, and were left on this part. But these colonial lines do not decide who we are and our identity. And that's why I say that these Afghans who are in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, including my family, my paternal family as well, but more so these people who are now called refugees, if you go back, they're actually on their own land. This is their native indigenous land, and so they become an outsider on their own land. So there's a lot of politics of identity, and so what I have experienced in my personal life, not as a researcher, is that a lot of Pashtuns, because on Afghanistan's east side is where most of the Pashtun population is, right? So in Pakistan, they are in an identity crisis. The Pashtuns, they don't know because they're not fully accepted by the eastern side of the country, which is predominantly Punjabis. They are not accepted on that side because there's a line in there. So a lot of the young people are in an identity crisis, and I just want to acknowledge here the work that Manzoor Pashtun, the leader of the Pashtun Tahfuz movement, have been doing by making people aware who they are. And again, this is not coming from my research. This is coming from my personal experience, and I'm one of those people who realized over the last 10 years, oh my God, I was going through an identity crisis, and now I know who I am and who my grandparents have been, because it's very important. I don't know if it's part of that age when you realize, I want to go back to my roots. I want to know where I have come from, which blood is running, is in my veins. And I think, so I only very briefly touch on that because, again, I'm not a historian, but it's very important to understand the political history of this land to be able to understand why the dehumanization of Afghan refugees is evil, and especially at the hands of the media, but also the public. who are at the mercy of the media, whatever the media tells them. There's so many people in Pakistan who have not met or interacted directly with an Afghan refugee, and they still have a lot to say about Afghan refugees. Similar to Australia, a lot of people that live in bigger cities have never met an indigenous person and still have a lot to say about indigenous people. And so that's the kind of mentality that I'm trying to change through my research, to just make society a better place to live in. So Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and parts of Balochistan, so all, the West, so there are maps available on the internet, it's very easy to find them, and it's not very old either. It's just 100 years, or the Duran line is not very old. It's pretty recent, so it's very well documented as well. Sometimes I feel like non-violence is also, by telling people not to be violent, and of course I do not project violence of any kind, but there is a different politics to non-violence movements as well that we saw in the 1940s as well, with Mahatma Gandhi and Bacha Khan as well. And again, that's a completely different side of the story. But what I mean to say is that this thought that was triggered in the public, in most of the young Pashtun people in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, was like, what? And of course, as they say that God says that I have signs for people who understand, right? So even in these things, there are signs for people who use their brain. And so coming from my own personal story, I was definitely moved to think about who I am, by these movements about Pashtuns and where they come from and who are they, and what has been happening to them, and how have they been used and exploited by the British. And then of course, and this is complicated history. Like, you can't just put it in 1 hour. You've got so many books and ideas of, there's so many actors involved in different parts, every decade there is a new actor who's playing different roles. But to simplify that, identity crisis is definitely something that people suffer from when they have had a complicated political situation for centuries, and specifically for the last 4 decades. Yeah.